The fireworks over Moscow on the night of May 9th, 1945, were visible from 30 kilometers away. In Berlin, soldiers wept openly in the streets. In London, crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, embracing strangers, singing songs they barely knew the words to. In New York, Times Square became a single living organism, a body of 2 million people exhaling the same breath of relief after 6 years of the most catastrophic war in human history. The numbers alone were staggering enough to silence any room. 60 million dead, entire nations reduced to rubble, cities that had stood for centuries, erased in an afternoon. And yet in the spring of 1945, there was something that felt, however briefly, like justice. The monster had been slain, the nightmare was over, the world had survived, and then the trials began. In the autumn of 1945, 24 of the most powerful men in the Nazi machinery sat inside a courtroom in the German city of Nuremberg. The proceedings lasted nearly a year. The world watched through newsreel cameras and newspaper photographs as Hermann Goering adjusted his headphones and listened to his own crimes read aloud. As Rudolf Hess stared at the ceiling as if the words had nothing to do with him. As the evidence, mountains of it documented by the Nazis themselves with their infamous bureaucratic precision, was laid before the tribunal in folders and binders and boxes stacked to the rafters. 12 men received death sentences. 7 received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted. The proceedings were broadcast, translated, printed, and dissected across the globe. Justice had been done. The headlines said so. The politicians said so. The survivors, many of them, wanted desperately to believe it. But somewhere in a small apartment in Genoa, Italy, a man with a new name, a new passport, and a new haircut was eating breakfast and reading those same headlines with something close to amusement. Here's the question that nobody wanted to ask in the spring of 1945, because the answer was too uncomfortable to sit with during a celebration. Where were the others? Not the 24 men in the dock at Nuremberg, not the generals whose photographs were already famous, whose names appeared in every newspaper. Those men had been captured, tried, and sentenced. The machinery of international justice, however imperfect, had reached them. The question was about the thousands, some historians estimate tens of thousands, who had operated the machinery itself. The camp administrators who had processed the paperwork, the guards who had run the blocks, the doctors who had conducted the experiments, the logisticians who had organized the transports, the regional commanders who had coordinated the operations, the low-level officers of the Schutzstaffel who had followed orders with such meticulous diligence that they never once had to ask what the orders meant. These men, and they were almost entirely men, did not appear in the newsreels. Their names were not announced from podiums. Many of them had been careful, methodical, and invisible throughout the entire war. They had done exactly what they were told. They had left behind minimal documentation. And the moment the tide of the war turned somewhere around 1943, they had begun to prepare, not for defeat, for disappearance. Planning, historians now understand, began years before the end. In the final chapters of the war, certain networks within the Nazi apparatus had already begun constructing what would later become known in Cold War intelligence circles as the ratlines, from the German word Rattenlinien, though that precise phrase was actually an American coinage used retroactively to describe something the participants never gave a single name. The ratlines were not one organization. They were not one operation. They were a loose, overlapping, improvised, and remarkably effective series of escape corridors that stretched from Germany and Austria southward through Italy, primarily through Rome and Genoa, and then across the Atlantic to South America. Argentina under Juan Perón had opened its doors with something close to deliberate policy. Between 1945 and 1952, it is estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 Europeans with questionable wartime histories arrived in Buenos Aires and fanned out across the country. Paraguay offered similar arrangements. Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, even Syria and Egypt in different configurations and for different reasons, became destinations for men who needed to become someone else entirely. The false documents that made this possible came from multiple sources. Some were forged outright. Some were obtained through genuine bureaucratic corruption. But a significant portion, and this is the part that would later cause the most serious diplomatic discomfort, came from the International Red Cross, which had, with the best of humanitarian intentions, created a system of travel documents for displaced persons that could be, and was, systematically exploited. A man who claimed to be a refugee, who presented himself as stateless, who could produce a plausible story about fleeing communist persecution, could obtain an International Committee of the Red Cross travel document, colloquially known as a Red Cross passport, and use it to board a ship to South America. The name on the document would not be his real name. The history on the document would not be his real history. He would arrive in Buenos Aires as someone new. He would learn Spanish. He would find work, sometimes in industry, sometimes in agriculture, sometimes with particular skills his previous career had given him in security or government consulting. He would attend church. He would become a neighbor, a colleague, a grandfather, and the world, still celebrating, would not look for him. But this was not simply a story of individual cowardice and opportunism. The ratlines did not function as well as they did purely through the initiative of men trying to save themselves. They functioned because they had help, serious, organized, institutional help. Certain networks within the Catholic Church, operating at the level of individual clergy and local organizations rather than the Vatican itself, though the precise degree of institutional knowledge remains historically contested, provided safe houses, documents, letters of introduction, and passage for men moving along the Italian corridor. The most frequently cited figure is Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian-born Roman Catholic bishop based in Rome, who operated openly, if not loudly, on behalf of what he described as anti-communist Europeans in need of humanitarian assistance. His network helped dozens of significant figures reach South America. And then there were the intelligence agencies of the Western democracies. This is the part of the story that took the longest to surface because it required the declassification of documents that governments had powerful reasons to keep sealed. But by the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, the evidence became overwhelming. The United States government, operating through the Office of Strategic Services and later the nascent Central Intelligence Agency, had made a calculated decision. The Soviet Union was the new enemy. The Cold War was beginning, and certain former Nazi officers, men who had run spy networks in Eastern Europe, who understood Soviet military doctrine, who had spent years operating behind Russian lines, possessed intelligence value that seemed to certain minds in Washington to outweigh their wartime histories. Operation Paperclip, officially authorized, brought over 700 German scientists, engineers, and technical experts to the United States. Some were rocket scientists, some were aeronautical engineers. Some had conducted experiments in concentration camps that had been classified as crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. They were given new identities, new positions, new security clearances, and new lives in American research facilities. This was not a secret program in the sense that nobody in government knew about it. It was a secret program in the sense that the American public was not told the full truth about who these men were and what they had done. And so the triumphant spring of 1945 contained within it, from the very beginning, a fracture. The fracture ran between what the victory meant symbolically, the defeat of evil, the restoration of justice, the punishment of the guilty, and what it meant practically on the level of individual human beings who had participated in that evil and were now, systematically and with considerable assistance, escaping its consequences. For the governments of the Western democracies, this fracture was manageable, uncomfortable but manageable. The Cold War created a framework in which almost anything could be justified by the logic of strategic necessity. Former enemies became assets. War crimes became resume items. But for the Soviet Union, a country that had lost not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but somewhere in the range of 27 million citizens. This was not a fracture that could be papered over with strategic logic. The dead of Leningrad, the dead of Stalingrad, the villages burned from the Baltic to the Caucasus, the prisoners who had not come home, the families that no longer existed. For a nation built on that scale of loss, the sight of perpetrators reinventing themselves as respectable citizens of Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo was not a geopolitical inconvenience. It was a personal insult to every surviving Soviet soul. And somewhere in the corridors of Moscow's intelligence apparatus, in offices that did not officially exist, men who had spent the war doing things that history would never fully record were beginning to ask a different kind of question. Not where were the criminals. They knew where some of them were. The question was, what were they going to do about it? There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a country after a catastrophic war. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of exhaustion, of a civilization that has spent everything it had and is now standing in the ruins of itself, counting what remains. In the Soviet Union in the summer of 1945, that silence had a specific texture. It was the silence of 27 million empty chairs, of villages where the women outnumbered the men 4-1, of children who had grown up knowing nothing but evacuation, rationing, and the particular mathematics of survival. Joseph Stalin understood this silence. He had, in his own cold and calculating way, helped create it, not only through the war itself, but through the purges of the 1930s that had hollowed out the Red Army's officer corps before the first German tank crossed the Soviet border. He was not a man given to sentiment. He was not a man who wept over the dead. But he understood, with the precise political instinct that had kept him in power for 2 decades, what that silence meant to the people who lived inside it. It meant they needed to believe that the sacrifice had been worth something, that the dead had not simply vanished into the earth for nothing, that the criminals who had ordered the burning of their villages, the starvation of their cities, the systematic destruction of their families, that those criminals were being held to account. Nuremberg helped. Nuremberg was useful. Stalin had pushed hard for the tribunal, had insisted on it over British reluctance and American ambivalence, had sent his own prosecutors and his own evidence. The spectacle of Nazi leaders in the dock, humiliated, diminished, forced to listen to their own crimes read aloud in 4 languages. That was valuable. It was the kind of justice that could be photographed and printed on the front page of Pravda. But Stalin's intelligence services were telling him something that Pravda would never print. The men in the dock at Nuremberg were not the only men responsible. They were, in the cold terminology of intelligence assessment, the visible apex of a very large pyramid. And the base of that pyramid, thousands of men, perhaps tens of thousands, was in the process of quietly, methodically, and successfully disappearing. The reports that came across Stalin's desk in the months following victory were not comforting reading. Soviet intelligence assets across Europe were tracking the movement of former SS officers, Gestapo operatives, camp administrators, and collaborationist leaders from occupied territories. The picture that emerged was not chaotic. It was organized. The men vanishing from Germany and Austria were not simply running. They were being moved. There were networks. There were safe houses. There were people at border crossings who looked the other way at the right moment. There were forged documents of a quality that suggested professional production rather than amateur improvisation. And most disturbing of all, there were signs, early, fragmentary, but consistent, that some of the men being moved were being moved with Western knowledge, and in certain cases, with Western assistance. For the Soviet intelligence apparatus, this was not simply a humanitarian or legal problem. It was a strategic one. The men disappearing into South America and the Middle East were not merely war criminals in the abstract sense. Many of them possessed operational knowledge of Soviet territory, of the human geography of Ukraine, the Baltic states, Belarus. They had run networks, recruited informants, identified resistance structures. Some of them had worked alongside nationalist underground movements that were still active, still fighting Soviet authority in the forests of Lithuania and the mountains of western Ukraine. They were not simply guilty men seeking safety. They were potential assets for anyone willing to use them. This realization sharpened the conversation inside Soviet intelligence considerably. The question was no longer purely about justice. However, the men in those offices defined that word. It was about the continuation of a conflict that had never, in their view, truly ended. The front lines had dissolved. The uniforms had been put away. But the war, the real war, the one fought in the shadows, the one that had no official beginning and would have no official end, that war was ongoing. Concept that began to take shape inside the corridors of Soviet intelligence in the late 1940s was described in the internal language of those organizations, in various ways depending on who was speaking and in what context. But the essence of it crystallized around a phrase that certain historians of Soviet intelligence working from documents declassified decades later have rendered in English as the shadow of victory. The idea was this: the official victory of 1945 had created a public reality, a world of treaties, tribunals, international agreements, and diplomatic norms. In that public reality, the war was over. The criminals had been punished, and the Soviet Union was a law-abiding member of the community of nations working toward a peaceful future. But beneath that public reality existed a shadow reality, a world where the war had not ended, where the criminals had not been fully punished, where the enemies of the Soviet state were still active and still dangerous. And in the shadow reality, different rules applied. In the shadow reality, the constraints of international law were not limitations, they were obstacles. In the shadow reality, the only question that mattered was not, is this legal, but is this necessary? The decision to act in that shadow reality was not made in a single meeting on a single day. It was the product of a gradual institutional consensus that formed over several years, shaped by specific events, specific failures, and the specific worldview of the men who ran Soviet intelligence in the post-war period. But at its center, animating the entire enterprise, was a conclusion that the men in those offices had reached through their own particular form of logic. The international courts could not reach these men. The Western governments would not reach them, and in some cases were actively protecting them, which meant that if the Soviet Union wanted to reach them, it would have to do so on its own. Outside the courtrooms, outside the treaties, outside the light entirely. And the Soviet Union, after 27 million dead, had decided that it was willing to do exactly that. What this decision looked like in practice required a particular kind of institutional architecture, one that was invisible by design, self-contained by necessity, and accountable only to the very top of the Soviet command structure. The existing organizations provided the foundation. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, had spent the entirety of the Stalin years developing expertise in operations that left no official trace. Its successor organizations, which reorganized and renamed themselves with a frequency that itself served as a form of bureaucratic camouflage, had entire departments whose existence was known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of government. Within these structures, a special capacity was being quietly expanded and refined, not for conventional espionage, not for the gathering of intelligence, the running of agents, the analysis of foreign policy, for something more direct, more final. The men recruited for this work were chosen by criteria that had little to do with conventional qualification. They needed to be capable of operating entirely alone in foreign countries for extended periods, without any form of official support or acknowledgement. If they succeeded, no one would ever publicly know. If they failed, the Soviet government would not recognize them. If they were captured, they were on their own. They needed to speak languages fluently enough to pass as natives, not just German or Polish, but the specific regional dialects and social registers that would allow them to move through a city without leaving a trace of foreignness. They needed to be capable of constructing and maintaining a false identity, not as a performance, but as a genuine parallel life, one that could withstand extended scrutiny from professionals trained to find exactly what they were hiding. and they needed to be capable of carrying out at the appropriate moment an act of termination, clean, silent, attributable to natural causes or accident, and then walking away from it and continuing their cover life as if nothing had happened. These were not men who could be created quickly. They were the product of years of selection and training and operational experience, and in the post-war Soviet intelligence apparatus they existed. They had been forged by the war itself, by the particular demands of operating behind enemy lines in conditions where discovery meant death, where improvisation was the only available tool, and where the difference between success and failure was measured in seconds and centimeters. The moral architecture of the decision, and there was a moral architecture, however disturbing its geometry, rested on a foundation that the men involved in it almost certainly believed, at least in the beginning. The targets were real criminals, not suspected criminals, not political opponents dressed up in the language of criminality for bureaucratic convenience. That was a different Soviet tradition entirely, and a vast one. The men being identified for this program had administered concentration camps. They had organized mass shootings in the occupied territories. They had, in some cases, been responsible for the deaths of thousands or tens of thousands of specific documented human beings. The evidence existed. In many cases, it was the Nazis themselves who had documented it, in the characteristic bureaucratic thoroughness that would later serve as the primary evidentiary basis for historical scholarship. The problem was not establishing what these men had done. The problem was that the legal mechanisms that might have punished them were either inaccessible, because the men were beyond the jurisdiction of any court that would try them, or unwilling, because certain Western governments had made their own calculations about the relative utility of war criminals versus Cold War assets. And so the argument made inside those Soviet offices was not entirely without a form of moral weight. If the courts will not act, and the governments will not act, and the men responsible for mass atrocities are currently eating breakfast in Buenos Aires and attending their children's football matches, then what does justice actually mean? Is it a process, or is it an outcome? And if it is an outcome, who is responsible for delivering it when the designated institutions have failed? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have comfortable answers. The men who asked them in those offices in Moscow in the late 1940s were not philosophers. They were intelligence professionals trained to find solutions to problems. And they had identified a problem and were constructing a solution. The solution had a shape. It had a structure. It was beginning to have names. And one name above all the others was already moving toward the center of it. A man who had spent his entire adult life operating in exactly the space between the official and the invisible, between the sanctioned and the necessary, between the law and what happened when the law looked the other way. His name was Pavel Sudoplatov, and he was about to build something that the 20th century had never quite seen before, and has never fully reckoned with since. There is a photograph of Pavel Sudoplatov that circulated in Western intelligence files during the Cold War. It shows a compact, unremarkable man with a broad Slavic face, dark eyes that give away nothing, and the kind of stillness that certain people develop when they have spent decades in rooms where the wrong expression could end a career or a life. He does not look like a monster. He does not look like a hero. He looks, above all else, like a man who has learned to look like nothing in particular. That quality, the ability to be present without being visible, to occupy space without drawing attention, to move through the world without leaving a readable impression, was not incidental to Sudoplatov's career. It was the foundation of it, and it was the quality he would spend the most productive years of his professional life cultivating in others. Pavel Anatolyevich Sudoplatov was born in 1907 in Melitopol, a mid-sized city in what is now southern Ukraine. His childhood was shaped by revolution and civil war, the same forces that were reshaping every life in the former Russian Empire during those years. He joined the Communist Party as a teenager, was recruited into the security services before he was 20, and carried out his first assassination at an age when most young men in other countries were finishing their university degrees. The target was Yevhen Konovalets, the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, a man the Soviet intelligence apparatus considered one of its most dangerous enemies. The method was a box of chocolates containing an explosive device delivered personally by the young Sudoplatov in Rotterdam in 1938. Sudoplatov handed the box to Konovalets, excused himself from the meeting, walked out of the building, and was several blocks away when the explosion occurred. He was 30 years old. He had already done things that most intelligence professionals spend entire careers only theorizing about, and he had done them with a composure that his superiors noted, filed, and decided was too valuable to waste on anything ordinary. What made Sudoplatov exceptional was not simply his willingness to carry out operations that other men found uncomfortable. Many men in the Soviet security apparatus during the Stalin years were willing, enthusiastically even, to do terrible things. The willingness to act without scruple was not a rare commodity in that environment. What made Sudoplatov exceptional was his mind. He was, by every account that survives, including his own extraordinary memoir, written decades later after his release from prison, a man of genuine strategic intelligence. He did not simply execute plans, he designed them. He thought in multiple layers simultaneously, constructing operations that had contingencies built into their contingencies, that could absorb failure at one level without collapsing at another, that created outcomes whose true architecture was invisible to anyone who had not been present at their conception. He understood better than almost anyone in the Soviet apparatus of his era that the most effective operation was the one that never looked like an operation at all, the death that appeared to be a heart attack, the accident that left no investigable cause, the disappearance that generated no body, no witness, no thread to pull. The goal was not simply to eliminate a target. The goal was to eliminate a target in a way that raised no questions, or, better still, in a way that raised questions pointing in entirely the wrong direction. This philosophy shaped everything he built. The institutional foundation for Sudoplatov's post-war work had been constructed piece by piece throughout the war years themselves. The organization known as SMERSH, a contraction of the Russian phrase meaning death to spies, had been created in 1943 as a military counterintelligence agency operating within the Red Army. Its official mandate was the identification and neutralization of enemy agents, saboteurs, and defectors within Soviet military structures. Its unofficial mandate was considerably broader. SMERSH operated with a degree of autonomy that was unusual even by the standards of Soviet security organizations. It reported directly to Stalin, bypassing the normal chains of institutional accountability. Its officers had authority that superseded rank in the conventional military hierarchy, and it had developed over the course of the war a body of operational knowledge about how to surveil a target without being detected, how to construct a cover identity that would withstand professional scrutiny, how to move across borders in wartime conditions. That represented perhaps the most sophisticated practical intelligence tradecraft in the world at that moment. When the war ended and SMERSH was absorbed into the MGB, the Ministry of State Security, one of the predecessor organizations of the KGB, the knowledge did not disappear. The people who carried it dispersed into new organizational structures, but the expertise accumulated, refined, and deepened. And within those new structures, under Sudoplatov's coordination, certain units were established that had no official designation, no public budget line, and no existence in any document that would ever be available for review. These units were, in the language that intelligence historians would later use, special tasks departments. Their specific function was operations that could not be acknowledged, conducted against targets that could not be officially named, using methods that had no place in any treaty or legal framework that the Soviet Union had signed. Sudoplatov ran them with the same architectural precision he brought to every other aspect of his work. He did not involve himself in operational details unnecessarily. He selected the right people, gave them the right resources, established the right objectives, and then created the conditions in which those people could work without interference from the bureaucratic machinery that surrounded them on all sides. People he selected were a specific type of human being, and understanding that type is essential to understanding what the organization he built was actually capable of. They were almost universally multilingual, not in the tourist sense of having studied a language in school and achieving functional communication, in the deep sense, the sense of having absorbed a language at a level where the dreams came in that language, where the instinctive emotional response arrived in that language before the conscious mind could intervene. Several of the most effective operatives in Sudoplatov's network had grown up in borderland regions, in the complex ethnic geography of Western Ukraine, the Baltic states, or the former Austro-Hungarian territories, where switching between languages and cultural registers was simply a feature of daily life rather than a learned skill. They were also people who had, through the specific experiences of their wartime careers, developed a relationship with moral certainty that was different from the ordinary human relationship with that quality. Most people, even people who work in dangerous or morally complex professions, retain a functioning internal resistance to crossing certain lines. The resistance may be overcome, but it exists and it exerts a force. The people Sudoplatov selected had, through one path or another, moved past that resistance, not necessarily through cruelty. It would be a mistake to imagine these as more men who enjoyed what they did, though some surely did, more often through a form of conviction. They had constructed, through their wartime experiences and their ideological formation, a framework in which what they were being asked to do was not a violation of their values, but an expression of them. They were not breaking a moral code. They were, in their own understanding, enforcing one. This made them extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily dangerous, and in the long run, extraordinarily difficult for the system that had created them to safely contain. Target list that took shape over the late 1940s was organized by a logic that combined strategic priority with operational feasibility. At the top were the leaders of nationalist underground movements operating in Soviet-controlled territories, primarily the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and its political leadership, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which had continued armed resistance against Soviet authority well into the late 1940s and in isolated pockets beyond. These men were priorities not simply as symbols, but as operational commanders actively directing networks that were causing real, ongoing problems for Soviet consolidation in the Western territories. Below them were former SS and Gestapo officers who had operated specifically in Soviet-occupied territories and whose detailed knowledge of human networks, informant structures, and geographic specifics of Soviet regions made them potentially valuable to Western intelligence, which Soviet analysts correctly assessed was actively recruiting from exactly this population. Then came the category of scientists and technical experts, primarily those whose work had been in fields with direct military application, whose expertise the Soviet Union wanted either recruited or denied to Western competitors. And finally, the category that was perhaps the most personally significant to the men doing the work, the traitors. Former Soviet citizens, former members of the security services, people who had defected or been captured and had chosen to cooperate with the enemy. These men were targets not purely for the intelligence value of eliminating them, though that was real, but because their continued existence represented a kind of insult to the institutional culture of the organizations that hunted them. In the moral framework of Soviet intelligence, defection was not a human choice made under extreme pressure. It was the ultimate betrayal, and the ultimate betrayal demanded an ultimate response. By the end of the 1940s, the machine was built. It had its organizational structure, compartmentalized, autonomous, reporting through channels that bypassed normal institutional oversight. It had its personnel, selected, trained, seasoned by wartime experience, and psychologically configured for work that most human beings could not perform without breaking. It had its target list, prioritized, regularly updated, informed by intelligence flowing in from networks across Europe, the Middle East, and South America. And it had its methods, a toolkit of techniques that ranged from surveillance and intelligence gathering through to options that left no trace and raised no questions. It had in Sudoplatov a commander who understood it at every level simultaneously, who could think about grand strategy and operational detail in the same breath, who could construct a plan that would unfold over months or years and anticipate the points at which it might fail, and who had the personal experience, the credibility, and the particular coldness of vision to make decisions that other men would have found paralyzing. What it did not have, what it could not have by the nature of what it was any mechanism of external accountability, any check that existed outside the system itself, any voice that could say, this target is wrong, this method is wrong, this decision exceeds what any government has the right to do. That absence would not matter for a while. While the targets were men whose crimes were documented and whose guilt was not in serious doubt, the absence of accountability was easy to ignore. The machine was running efficiently. The results were, by the criteria the machine used to evaluate itself, satisfactory. But machines built without external accountability do not stay precisely calibrated forever. They drift, the criteria shift, the targets change, and by the time anyone notices that the machine is no longer doing precisely what it was originally built to do, it has been running long enough that stopping it has become a problem in itself. That problem was coming. But in the late 1940s, in the offices where Sudoplatov and his colleagues worked in the particular silence of men who were not permitted to discuss their work with anyone, the machine was simply running, and the hunting had begun. There is a moment in the education of every serious historian of intelligence work when the abstraction collapses, when the language of special tasks and active measures and wet operations, the sanitized bureaucratic vocabulary that intelligence organizations have always used to discuss the things they cannot name directly, gives way to the physical, concrete, irreversible reality of what those phrases actually describe. When the euphemism dissolves and what remains is simply a human being in a specific city on a specific afternoon, whose life ended because someone in an office in Moscow had written a name on a list. The Soviet Special Tasks program of the post-war decades was, in its operational mechanics, a work of considerable sophistication. It was not simply violence. It was violence, engineered to be invisible, designed from the ground up to produce outcomes that would never be investigated as the outcomes they actually were, conducted by people who would never be identified as the people they actually were, authorized by a government that would never acknowledge the authorizations it had actually given. Understanding how it worked requires moving past the abstraction and into the specific, into the laboratories, into the training facilities, into the operational planning documents that would eventually, decades later, surface in partially declassified archives and in the testimonies of men who had lived inside the system and survived long enough to describe it. Foundation of the entire enterprise was chemistry. The Soviet Union's investment in what might be called special chemistry, the development of substances designed specifically for use in covert operations, was by the 1950s almost certainly the most advanced program of its kind in the world. It operated under the institutional umbrella of a laboratory that existed within the security services under various designations across different periods, referred to in intelligence literature by the nickname the Chamber, or in Russian, Camera. The Chamber's primary mission was the development of substances that could cause death or incapacitation in ways that would not be detected by standard forensic examination. The specific requirements drove the research in particular directions. A substance that killed quickly but left detectable traces was operationally useless. It would trigger an investigation, and an investigation might eventually lead somewhere dangerous. What was needed were substances that killed in ways that looked like the body's own failures, a heart that had simply stopped, lungs that had simply ceased to function, a stroke that had arrived at an inconvenient moment for the target and a convenient one for the organization. The chemists of the chamber worked toward this goal with the same institutional dedication that Soviet scientists brought to every priority program. They developed compounds that administered in doses small enough to be delivered through aerosol spray, through skin contact, or through contamination of food or drink would produce cardiovascular or respiratory failure within a window of hours. Long enough that the agent would be well clear of the scene, short enough that the connection between the moment of administration and the moment of death would not be apparent to anyone conducting a standard medical examination. The delivery systems were engineered with corresponding ingenuity. The most famous, because it would eventually become publicly known through the testimony of a defector, was a device concealed within the body of an ordinary-looking fountain pen. The pen did not write. It contained a compressed gas mechanism that, when triggered by a specific action, released a fine aerosol mist of the active compound in a cone approximately 1 meter in diameter. A man standing close enough to his target for a normal conversation was close enough to administer a lethal dose without any physical contact, without any visible action that a bystander might register as suspicious, and without leaving any trace on either the target or himself. Other delivery systems were adapted from objects that would survive scrutiny at border crossings and in hotel rooms: buttons on a coat, the handle of an umbrella, the clasp of a briefcase. The engineering was precise, miniaturized, and in many cases genuinely remarkable as a technical achievement, entirely apart from the moral dimensions of its application. Beyond chemistry, the toolkit included methods that were more direct but engineered with equal attention to the problem of attribution. Firearms with sound suppressors had been a feature of intelligence operations since the Second World War, but the Soviet program developed specific configurations optimized for the particular demands of urban operations in Western European cities. Weapons small enough to be concealed on a person passing through normal public environments, reliable enough to function after extended periods of concealment, and chambered for ammunition that would not be immediately identifiable as Soviet military issue. For situations requiring the physical removal of a target rather than death in place, either because the target possessed information that made capture more valuable than elimination, or because the operational circumstances made a clean death impossible, the program had developed protocols for what it called exfiltration under duress. These operations were considerably more complex than a straightforward termination. They required weeks of preparatory surveillance to establish the target's patterns with sufficient precision to identify a window of vulnerability. They required transportation infrastructure, vehicles, safe houses, and ultimately a route to a Soviet-accessible border or a vessel that could reach international waters. And they required the capacity to maintain physical control of a resistant human being for an extended period without attracting attention. The cover mechanisms for these operations were elaborate. A fishing vessel registered in a neutral country with a crew whose papers were impeccable could move along European coastlines without generating the kind of scrutiny that would expose its actual purpose. A diplomatic aircraft benefiting from the conventions of international law that protected diplomatic pouches and diplomatic personnel from search could carry almost anything across a border that would have stopped a civilian transport. The staging of accidents and natural events rounded out the operational menu. A man found at the bottom of a staircase in his apartment building had, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, fallen. A car that left a mountain road had, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, suffered a mechanical failure or a momentary lapse of driver attention. These were not options that required the specialized chemistry of the chamber or the engineering of concealed weapons. They required patience, surveillance, physical access, and the judgment to act within a window that might be measured in seconds. Against this operational background, 3 cases stand as the clearest illustrations of the program in practice, each representing a different phase of its development, a different method from its toolkit, and a different chapter in the story of what happens when secret operations eventually encountered the uncontrollable variable of human conscience. The first was not, strictly speaking, a post-war operation, but it established the template for everything that followed, and its principal architect was Sudoplatov himself. Leon Trotsky had been living in exile since 1929, first in Turkey, then France, then Norway, and finally in Mexico, where he had established himself in a fortified compound in the Mexico City suburb of Coyoacán. Stalin's desire to eliminate Trotsky was not primarily about the man's operational significance as an enemy. Trotsky was, by 1940, more symbol than threat, but symbols matter enormously in authoritarian systems, and the symbol of a living, writing, internationally visible critic who had known Stalin personally and who used that knowledge to devastating effect in his published work was intolerable. The operation to reach Trotsky had been running for years before it succeeded. A first attempt in May of 1940 involving a team of approximately 20 men who attacked the compound with automatic weapons and incendiary devices failed completely. Trotsky and his wife survived by lying flat on the floor of their bedroom while the walls around them were destroyed. The failure was an embarrassment that Sudoplatov, who had overall coordination of the operation, understood required a completely different approach. The second approach was a masterwork of the penetration methodology that Sudoplatov considered far superior to brute force. A Spanish communist named Ramon Mercader had, over a period of years, constructed a false identity as a Belgian businessman named Frank Jackson. Through patient cultivation of a woman in Trotsky's circle, Mercader had gradually gained access to the compound itself, first as an acquaintance, then as a trusted visitor. He had been inside the compound multiple times before the day of the operation. He was not a suspicious figure. He was a familiar one. On the 20th of August, 1940, Mercader entered Trotsky's study on the pretext of discussing an article he had written and wanted Trotsky's opinion on. He carried, concealed under his raincoat, an ice axe with the handle shortened for easier concealment. While Trotsky was reading the article, Mercader struck him once from behind. Trotsky died the following day. Mercader was arrested at the scene. He had not planned an escape route, a detail that Sudoplatov later described as the operation's primary flaw. He served 20 years in a Mexican prison, was released in 1960, and was subsequently awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in a ceremony that, naturally, was not publicly announced. The operation demonstrated both the extraordinary reach of the Soviet program, that it could penetrate a fortified compound in Mexico City through a years-long cultivation operation, and the template that would define its most effective subsequent work: patience, identity construction, relationship building, and a final action taken from within the circle of trust rather than from outside it. 17 years later, in the autumn of 1957, a man named Lev Rebet descended the staircase of an office building on Karlsplatz in Munich and stepped out onto the street. Rebet was a leader of a faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, one of the nationalist exile organizations that Soviet intelligence had been monitoring and targeting since the late 1940s. He was not the most prominent figure in that movement, but he was significant enough to appear on the target list, and Munich had been identified as a city where Soviet operational assets had sufficient infrastructure to work. The agent assigned to the operation was a young man named Bogdan Stashinsky, a Ukrainian-born Soviet intelligence operative who had been recruited in the early 1950s and had spent several years building cover in Western Europe. He had surveilled Rebet for weeks, establishing his patterns, identifying the moments of vulnerability in his daily routine. On the morning of the operation, Stashinsky positioned himself in the stairwell of the building where Rebet had an appointment. When Rebet appeared ascending the stairs, Stashinsky was descending, two men passing in a stairwell. Perfectly ordinary urban encounter. As they passed, Stashinsky activated the device he was carrying, one of the chamber's aerosol weapons concealed in a cylindrical tube resembling a rolled-up newspaper, and directed a brief spray of prussic acid vapor toward Rebet's face. Rebet continued up the stairs. He reached the landing. He collapsed. He was found shortly afterward and pronounced dead of an apparent heart attack. He was 41 years old, but he had a history of cardiovascular irregularities. The Munich authorities had no reason to look further. The case was closed as a natural death. Stashinsky, following his operational protocol, had taken an antidote tablet before the operation that protected him from the compound's effects. He walked out of the building, disposed of the device in a canal, and left Munich on a scheduled train. 2 years later, in 1959, he used the same method on a larger and far more significant target. Stepan Bandera, the most prominent and internationally recognized leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, a figure who represented in the Soviet intelligence assessment not merely an irritant but a genuine organizational threat, was killed in the entryway of his Munich apartment building on the 15th of October, 1959. The cause of death was again recorded as heart failure. Again, the case was initially closed. But here the machinery encountered the variable it could not engineer away. Bogdan Stashinsky had, in the years since the Rebet operation, undergone a transformation that his handlers had not detected, and his organizational structure had no mechanism for identifying. He had met and fallen in love with a young East German woman named Inga Pohl. He had married her, and through that relationship, through the experience of being known by another person, of existing in someone else's life as a real human being rather than an operational identity, something in him had shifted. He had carried out the Bandera operation under orders. But afterward, in the months that followed, the internal distance that had allowed him to function, the carefully maintained separation between the man who did these things and the man who ate dinner and talked about the future with his wife, began to collapse. In August of 1961, 2 days after the Berlin Wall was erected, Stashinsky crossed into West Berlin with his wife and turned himself in to West German authorities. He told them everything: the devices, the operations, the names, the methods, the structure of the program that had produced him. The international scandal that followed was significant enough that it reached the level of formal diplomatic protest. The West German government, through its federal prosecutor's office, conducted a full investigation. Stashinsky was tried and convicted, sentenced to 8 years, of which he served considerably less. The trial produced a public record that, for the first time, gave Western governments and Western publics a documented, court-verified account of the Soviet special tasks, programs, methods, and reach. And somewhere in Moscow, in the particular silence of offices where such matters were processed, the lesson was noted. Not the lesson that the program should stop. The lesson that its most significant vulnerability was not forensic, not operational, not technical. It was human. The machine could engineer around chemistry and ballistics and border controls. It could not engineer around the fact that the people it used were people, with inner lives, with relationships, with the capacity to change in ways that no selection process could predict and no training could prevent. That vulnerability would never be fully solved, and it would in time prove to be the most consequential flaw in everything Sudoplatov had built. There is a particular kind of professional irony that only intelligence work can produce. It is the irony of two organizations operating in the same city on the same day, hunting the same man. One to eliminate him, one to recruit him, both convinced that what they are doing is necessary, both operating outside the boundaries of the law they nominally serve, both, in their own institutional frameworks, entirely justified. This was not a hypothetical scenario in post-war Europe. It was a recurring operational reality. And understanding it requires stepping back from the Soviet program for a moment and acknowledging what was happening on the other side of the invisible boundary that divided the Cold War's shadow world. The Western intelligence agencies, primarily the American Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service, known as MI6, were not passive observers of the landscape that the ratlines had created. They were active participants in it. And their activity, in many cases, ran in a direction precisely opposite to the Soviet program's objectives. Where the Soviet program was identifying former Nazi officers and nationalist leaders as targets for elimination, the Western agencies were identifying many of the same men as potential assets for recruitment. The logic was the same logic that had produced Operation Paperclip. A cold, utilitarian calculation that the skills and knowledge these men possessed had a value that outweighed the moral cost of using them. They knew the Soviet Union's western territories from the inside. They had run agent networks in Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Byelorussia. They spoke the languages, understood the human geography, and had existing relationships with underground structures that were still, in some cases, actively operating. To the architects of early Cold War Western intelligence, this was not a difficult equation. The war was over. A new war, colder, slower, but in its own way equally existential, had begun. And in that new war, a man's wartime history was less important than his current operational utility. The collision between these two programs, one hunting, one recruiting, produced situations of extraordinary complexity that intelligence historians are still, decades later, working to fully document. In some cases, Soviet agents arrived in a Western European city to surveil a target and discovered that the target had already been folded into a protective relationship with a Western agency. The man was being watched, not to be eliminated, but to be kept alive and useful. He had handlers. He had, in some cases, a new identity provided not by his own initiative, but by the organizational infrastructure of an allied intelligence service. He was, in the operational language of the field, covered. A covered target presented a problem that went beyond the tactical. Eliminating a man under Western intelligence protection risked not merely the failure of a single operation, but the exposure of Soviet capabilities and methods in a way that would set back the entire program. It risked a confrontation that both sides, at the level of their respective leaderships, generally preferred to avoid, not out of moral scruple, but out of the pragmatic recognition that certain escalations created more problems than they solved. And so in some cases, the Soviet program made the calculation to leave covered targets alone, to move them down the priority list, to wait for a moment when the protective relationship loosened, when the asset's utility to Western handlers diminished, when the coverage became less attentive. In other cases, the calculation went the other way, and the collision between the two programs produced outcomes that neither had fully anticipated. The results of the Soviet Special Tasks program, assessed honestly against its own stated objectives, were mixed in ways that the program's architects would not have found satisfying. On one level, the program achieved genuine operational successes. The elimination of Lev Rebet and Stepan Bandera, whatever their ultimate political consequences, demonstrated a technical and operational sophistication that Western intelligence assessed with considerable respect. The program reached targets in the heart of Western European cities using methods that, until Stashinsky's defection, left no forensically detectable trace. The penetration operations that preceded and enabled these actions represented years of patient, disciplined work of a quality that any intelligence service would have recognized as exceptional. Several nationalist underground leaders who had continued directing armed resistance against Soviet authority in the Western territories were eliminated or captured in operations that significantly degraded those organizations' ability to function. The networks that had coordinated the movements of men, money, and weapons across the Soviet western border became less effective. The intelligence picture improved. The operational environment in those territories from the Soviet perspective became more manageable. These were real outcomes with real consequences. The Soviet leadership considered them within the framework it used to evaluate such things, justified returns on the investment, but the program also accumulated failures that were significant enough to raise questions about its ultimate effectiveness. The most glaring was Joseph Mengele. Mengele, the Auschwitz physician whose experiments on prisoners represented some of the most extensively documented atrocities of the entire Nazi program, had escaped through the ratlines to South America in 1949. He lived in Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil. He was on target lists. He was discussed in operational planning documents. Various efforts were made over the years to establish his location with sufficient precision to act. None of them succeeded. Mengele died in Brazil in 1979, a natural death in the water, while swimming off a beach near the coastal town of Bertioga. He was 67 years old. He had lived in South America for 30 years, had never been seriously close to capture or elimination, and had died peacefully in circumstances that, at the time, were not even known to the agencies that had been searching for him. His identity was not confirmed until his remains were exhumed and examined in 1985. The failure to reach Mengele was not unique. The operational geography of South America, its scale, its political complexity, the varying degrees of cooperation or active obstruction offered by different governments, made it genuinely difficult terrain for an organization whose primary infrastructure was built around European operations. The program had reach. It did not have unlimited reach, and the failures mattered not only operationally, but in terms of the moral argument that had justified the program's existence in the first place. If the justification was justice, however extrajudicially defined, then a justice that reached some perpetrators and missed others, that succeeded in Munich and failed in Brazil, was not really justice in any coherent sense. It was selective, geographically limited, operationally constrained, and in its selectivity, arguably arbitrary. But the most consequential failures of the program were not the ones that involved missing a target. They were the ones that involved the people the program had used to reach its targets, the fate of the program's executors, the men and women who had actually carried out its operations, who had built the false identities and conducted the surveillance and administered the substances and walked away afterward, was in almost every case a story of institutional betrayal so complete and so systematic that it stands as one of the Cold War's most honestly documented moral disasters. The logic of the betrayal was straightforward and, from a certain perspective, coldly rational. The program's most fundamental operational requirement was deniability. The Soviet government could not acknowledge these operations. It could not acknowledge the people who had conducted them. Any living person who had participated in a special tasks operation and who retained detailed knowledge of it, who had administered it, who had authorized it, who had provided the technical means for it, was, by definition, a security risk of a specific and irreducible kind. The risk could be managed in various ways. Some operatives were given new identities and relocated within the Soviet system, moved to positions where their knowledge was contained and their access to any channel that might expose it was controlled. Some were gradually isolated, their operational roles diminished, their access to sensitive information cut off, their social and professional worlds narrowed until they existed in a kind of internal exile that left them technically free but effectively silenced. And some were eliminated by the system that had created them, not because they had done anything wrong, not because they had defected or threatened to expose anything, but simply because the organizational calculus determined that their continued existence represented a liability that outweighed any remaining utility. They knew too much. They had done too much. They were too deeply embedded in the program's history to be safely managed by any means other than removal. This was not a new phenomenon in the Soviet security apparatus. The pattern of eliminating people who knew too much was as old as the apparatus itself. It had claimed during the purges of the 1930s thousands of intelligence and security officers whose primary crime was having participated in operations that a later political configuration found inconvenient to acknowledge. The post-war program produced its own version of the same pattern, smaller in scale, more targeted, but structurally identical. The men who had carried out special tasks operations disappeared into the Soviet system, some into prison, some into psychiatric facilities, a mechanism that the security services had developed for the containment of people who knew things that could not be publicly acknowledged and who showed signs of being unwilling or unable to maintain the required silence. Some into a simple administrative erasure, stripped of rank, stripped of awards, stripped of the institutional identity that had been their entire existence, left to live out their remaining years as private citizens with no official history and no one they could safely speak to about the years that had defined them. The case of Pavel Sudoplatov himself is, in this context, almost perfectly emblematic of the system's relationship with the people it used. Sudoplatov had served the Soviet state with a consistency, an effectiveness, and a loyalty that were, by any professional measure, extraordinary. From his first operation in Rotterdam in 1938 through the coordination of the Trotsky assassination, in 1940 through the construction and management of the post-war special tasks apparatus, he had delivered results that the Soviet leadership had valued enough to keep expanding his mandate and his resources. He had also, over that same period, accumulated knowledge that was, by the standards of Soviet institutional security, genuinely dangerous. He knew the architecture of the program. He knew the names. He knew the methods. He knew the specific operations. He knew which members of the Soviet leadership had authorized what and when, and in exchange for what assurances. In 1953, following Stalin's death and the subsequent political upheaval that brought Khrushchev to power through a process that involved the arrest and execution of Stalin's security chief, Lavrentiy Beria, Sudoplatov was arrested. The charges against him were connected to his association with Beria, a convenient institutional scapegoat whose downfall allowed the new leadership to distance itself from the most uncomfortable aspects of the Stalin-era security apparatus. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served the full term. He was held in conditions that, by the standards of the Soviet prison system, were not the worst available, but which, for a man who had spent his entire adult life as an operational intelligence professional with freedom of movement across multiple countries, represented a total annihilation of everything that had constituted his existence. He was released in 1968. He was rehabilitated, officially, partially, decades later. He lived long enough to write his memoirs, published in the West in 1994 under the title Special Tasks, which became one of the most valuable primary sources available on the Soviet intelligence program of his era. He died in 1996, at the age of 89. The 15 years he spent in prison were served for crimes that were, in the most fundamental sense, the crimes of the state that imprisoned him. He had not acted independently. He had not acted for personal gain. He had acted precisely as the Soviet state had directed him to act, with the methods the Soviet state had provided, against targets the Soviet state had identified in pursuit of objectives the Soviet state had authorized. Every significant decision in his operational career had been made with the knowledge and approval of the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The state that imprisoned him was the same state that had built him, used him, and then found it institutionally convenient to designate him as the responsible party for decisions that had been made far above his level. This pattern, the state as architect, the individual as instrument, and the individual as scapegoat when the architecture becomes embarrassing, runs through the entire history of the Soviet Special Task Program like a structural flaw that was present from the foundation. The men who ran the networks, who conducted the surveillance, who built the false identities, who carried the devices and walked away afterward, they had understood at some level that they were operating in a world where the normal protections did not apply. They had accepted that understanding as a condition of the work. They had internalized the logic that, in the shadow reality, the ordinary rules were suspended. What many of them had not fully reckoned with was that the suspension of ordinary rules did not stop at the boundary between themselves and their targets. It extended inward, into the organization itself. The same logic that said the target had no right to the protection of law because of what he had done could be, and was, applied to the operative who had eliminated the target. When the operative became inconvenient, when he knew too much, when the political configuration changed, and his continued existence represented a liability. The shadow reality did not have borders. Once you entered it, it was very difficult to find your way back out. And the Soviet state, which had built the shadow reality and populated it with the most skilled and dedicated professionals it could find, had never had any intention of letting those professionals back out. That was the price. It was paid. in full by almost everyone who had been inside. There is a specific kind of official silence that is different from the silence of ignorance. Ignorance is empty. It contains nothing because nothing has been placed there. The silence of official denial is not empty at all. It is dense, deliberately constructed, maintained with active effort by people who know exactly what it contains and have made a considered decision that the contents must never surface. It is the silence of a sealed room, not abandoned but locked. And the difference matters because a locked room implies someone who holds the key, someone who made the choice to turn it. The Soviet Union's silence about the Special Tasks Program was of this second kind. From the moment the program's first post-war operations began in the late 1940s through the collapse of the Soviet state in 1991, the official position of the Soviet government was simple and consistent. These operations did not exist. The laboratories did not exist. The special departments did not exist. The operatives did not exist. Or rather, they existed as ordinary citizens, ordinary employees of ordinary government agencies, with ordinary careers that contained no extraordinary chapters. This silence was not careless. It was engineered with the same professional precision that the program itself had brought to its operations. Archives were classified at levels that placed them beyond the reach of any internal review process. Personnel files were sanitized. Operational records were destroyed or moved to storage facilities whose existence was itself classified. The bureaucratic paper trail that connected specific decisions to specific outcomes, that would have allowed a future investigator to trace the line from a name on a list in Moscow to a body on a staircase in Munich, was systematically interrupted at every point where it might have become legible. The silence served multiple purposes simultaneously, and understanding all of them is necessary for understanding why it was so completely maintained for so long. The first purpose was legal and diplomatic. The operations the program had conducted were, without exception, violations of the sovereignty of the countries in which they had occurred. They were violations of international agreements the Soviet Union had signed. They were, under the domestic law of every country where they had taken place, homicides, or in the cases involving abduction, kidnappings. Acknowledging them would have created legal and diplomatic exposure of a kind that the Soviet government was not prepared to accept. The second purpose was ideological. The Soviet Union had constructed as one of the central pillars of its international self-presentation the image of a peace-loving socialist state that operated according to principles of international law and mutual respect among nations. This image was, in many respects, a fiction, and a fiction that most informed observers in the West understood to be a fiction. But it was a necessary fiction, one that served real functions in Soviet foreign policy and in the political arguments the Soviet Union was conducting with the developing world, with Western leftists, with international institutions. Acknowledging a program of extrajudicial assassination conducted in foreign countries would have destroyed that image in a way that no amount of subsequent messaging could repair. It would have handed opponents of the Soviet Union an argument of extraordinary power, not the abstract argument that the Soviet system was repressive toward its own citizens, which many people in the West were prepared to discount or rationalize, but the concrete argument that the Soviet state sent agents to kill people on the streets of Munich and Vienna. That argument would have been much harder to dismiss. The third purpose was internal, and in some ways the most important. The program had been authorized at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The decisions that had set it in motion, that had identified the targets, that had provided the resources and the authorization, had been made by men who were, in the post-Stalin period, engaged in an ongoing process of positioning themselves as the correctors of Stalin's excesses. Acknowledging the program would have required acknowledging the decision-making that had produced it, and that acknowledgement would have been politically devastating to leaders who were simultaneously claiming that the worst of the Stalin era was behind them. The silence, therefore, protected not only the program but the people who had run it at the highest levels. It protected the institutional reputation of the Soviet state. and it protected the ideological narrative that the state required for its international functioning. But the silence extracted a price, and that price was paid not by the institutions that imposed the silence, but by the people it buried. The operatives of the Special Task Program, the men and women who had conducted the actual operations, who had built the cover identities and performed the surveillance and carried the devices, existed within the Soviet system in a condition that had no accurate name. They were present but invisible. They had histories that could not be spoken. They had done things that could not be acknowledged. They had served a state that would not recognize the service. For most people, a sense of identity, of knowing who one is and what one has done and why it mattered, depends at least partly on external acknowledgement, on the existence of other people who know the same story and confirm its reality. A soldier who has served in a war can speak about it, can find others who shared the experience, can situate his individual history within a collective narrative that gives it meaning. The operatives of the Special Tasks Program had none of this. Their collective narrative did not exist in any form that could be accessed or shared. Their individual histories were state secrets. The meaning of what they had done, if there was meaning, existed only inside their own heads, with no external confirmation and no possibility of seeking any. This was not simply a psychological inconvenience. For many of them, it appears to have been a form of slow erasure. The self is not a purely internal construction. It requires the friction of other people's knowledge to maintain its shape. Deprive it of that friction long enough, and it begins to lose definition, to become uncertain of its own edges, to question whether the things it remembers actually happened, whether the choices it made actually mattered, whether the person who made them actually existed in any sense that the world would recognize. Sudoplatov's memoir, written in his 80s after decades of enforced silence, has the particular quality of a man who is not merely recounting events, but asserting their reality against the weight of an official history that denied them. He's not simply telling a story. He's insisting that the story happened, that he was there, that it was real. The insistence itself is the most eloquent testimony to what the silence had cost him. The moral question that the program raises, and that its history refuses to resolve, is one of the most uncomfortable that the 20th century produced, and it remains in the 21st century, genuinely unresolved. The targets of the Soviet Special Tasks Program were, in the most significant cases, men who had committed real crimes of extraordinary scale. Stepan Bandera's organizational history included documented involvement in mass atrocities against Jewish and Polish civilians during the war years. The SS and Gestapo officers on the target lists had, in many cases, administered operations whose outcomes were measured in thousands of deaths. The men who had escaped through the ratlines and were living comfortable lives in South America had, in most cases, done so precisely because the normal mechanisms of accountability had failed to reach them. This creates a moral situation with no clean exit. If you argue that the Soviet program was simply wrong, that extrajudicial killing is always wrong regardless of the identity of the target, you are implicitly arguing that the comfortable retirement of the men who ran concentration camps was an acceptable outcome, because the alternative to extrajudicial action was no action at all. You are arguing that process matters more than outcome, that the integrity of legal procedure has a value that exceeds the injustice of allowing documented mass murderers to die peacefully in their beds. This is a defensible position. Many serious moral philosophers hold it, but it requires acknowledging what it concedes, that in the absence of effective legal mechanisms, the procedural argument becomes in practice an argument for impunity. If you argue, on the other hand, that the Soviet program was justified, that the target's crimes were so severe and the legal mechanism so thoroughly compromised that extrajudicial action was the only available form of justice, you are accepting a framework in which states can designate individuals for death outside any legal process, using criteria that are determined entirely by the state itself, with no external check on either the accuracy of the designation or the proportionality of the response. You are accepting a framework that has been used throughout history to justify the killing not only of genuine criminals, but of political opponents, dissidents, journalists, and anyone else the state finds inconvenient enough to designate as a threat. The Soviet program itself demonstrates this danger with perfect clarity. The same institutional apparatus that eliminated former SS officers also eliminated Soviet citizens whose primary crime was political inconvenience. The same methods were used, the same authorizations were obtained, the same silence was maintained afterward. The program did not have a reliable mechanism for distinguishing between a man who had administered a concentration camp and a man who had written an article that the Soviet leadership found embarrassing. Both could be designated. Both could be reached. Both could be erased. This is not a coincidence or an aberration. It is the predictable consequence of building an apparatus that operates outside accountability. Accountability is not merely a procedural formality. It is the mechanism by which the inevitable tendency of power to expand its own definitions of necessity is checked and corrected. Remove the mechanism, and the expansion follows as naturally as water finding its level. The history of the Soviet Special Task Program is, in this sense, not primarily a history of the Cold War. It is not primarily a history of Soviet intelligence or Nazi war criminals or the ratlines or the post-war settlement. These are its specific contents, the particular filling of a particular container. But the container itself is older and more universal. It is the story of what happens when a state, any state of any ideological orientation at any point in history, decides that the normal constraints on its behavior do not apply to a specific situation because the situation is extreme enough to justify their suspension. It is the story of how that decision, once made, proves almost impossible to reverse, how the definition of extreme enough expands with each iteration, how the apparatus built for the exceptional case becomes the infrastructure for the routine one, how the people used as instruments in the exceptional case become, in time, liabilities to be managed by the same methods they were trained to apply to others. The men who built the program believed at the beginning that they were operating in a genuine exception, that the combination of mass atrocity, failed international justice, and Cold War strategic competition created a set of circumstances so unusual that the normal rules simply did not apply. They may have been right about the circumstances. They were wrong about the exception. There are no exceptions. Not because the circumstances were not extreme. They were. Not because the targets were not guilty. Many of them were. But because an exception in the domain of state power is not a temporary suspension of a rule. It is the beginning of a new rule, and the new rule, once established, does not recognize the boundaries that were supposed to contain it. The Soviet state that maintained silence about this program for decades is gone. The archives that documented it have been partially opened, partially destroyed, partially transferred to successor organizations that have their own institutional reasons for selective disclosure. The men who conducted its operations are almost all dead. The targets who were reached are dead. Many of the targets who were not reached are also dead, of old age and comfortable anonymity, in countries that never asked too hard about their histories. What remains is the record, incomplete, fragmentary, distorted by the interests of everyone who has touched it, but real. Real enough to establish that these things happened, that people did them, that other people authorized them, that an entire institutional apparatus was constructed for the specific purpose of doing them efficiently and invisibly and without acknowledgement. And what the record asks of us, not as historians, not as analysts, but as people living in a world that still contains states and still contains the logic that produced this program, is a specific kind of attention, not the attention of condemnation, which is easy and costs nothing, not the attention of fascination, which mistakes the mechanics of darkness for its meaning, the attention of recognition, the recognition that the men who built this program were not monsters in any useful sense of the word. They were professionals, ideologues, patriots by their own lights, people who had lived through genuine catastrophe and had drawn from that experience a set of conclusions about what the world required of them. The recognition that the logic they followed, that the extremity of the circumstances justified the extremity of the response, is not a logic that died with the Soviet Union. It is available in every era, to every state, to every person in a position of sufficient power and sufficient conviction. The recognition that the silence which protected the program, the silence that buried the operatives, erased the history and allowed the institutions responsible to continue functioning without accountability, was not a unique feature of the Soviet system. It is a feature of every system that builds apparatus it cannot publicly acknowledge. The specific contents of the silence change, the structure of it does not. And the recognition, finally, that this story is not about the past in the sense that the past is safely over and its lessons can be applied from a comfortable distance. It is about the present, about the decisions being made right now in offices that do not officially exist, by people whose names will not appear in any public document, using methods that will not be described in any press release, against targets whose designation was made by a process that no external body will ever review. The program that Pavel Sudoplatov built in the ruins of the Second World War did not end with the Soviet Union. It evolved. It dispersed. Its methods were studied, adapted, improved, and deployed by organizations on every side of every conflict that followed. The specific ideology changed. The specific targets changed. The institutional justifications changed, the structure remained. This is what the history of the Soviet Special Task Program ultimately teaches. Not about Soviet intelligence, not about the Cold War, not about the specific men who ran it or the specific men it reached. It teaches about the architecture of power, when power decides that accountability is a luxury it cannot afford. It teaches about what states become when they build rooms they cannot publicly acknowledge and populate them with people they cannot officially recognize. It teaches that the shadow reality, once constructed, does not stay in the shadows. It expands. It normalizes. It becomes, in time, simply reality, with the shadow quality forgotten and the architecture preserved, and the locked rooms passed from one generation of key holders to the next, each generation inheriting the room without inheriting the full memory of what was placed inside it and why. The knowledge this history offers is not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It is meant to be used.